Well, it's 6:05, so I think it's a respectable, fashionably late time to begin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight on this very special evening for the ISE. I've been really looking forward to this myself since I knew that Joe and Alan were writing this book. I was thinking, my God, it's going to be a great event for the Institute for Social Ecology. I just want to say a word about the Institute for Social Ecology for people who aren't familiar. We're a popular education kind of think tank that is, we offer classes in revolutionary philosophy and politics, and you can go to our website, social.ecology.org, and find out about our programming. We run classes for credit and also for not credit for people who are just informal studiers or people who are taking, earning credits towards degrees. So tonight, and we also offer lecture series like the one offered tonight. So tonight I am so excited to be moderating the discussion about this fabulous book, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, co-authored by Joseph Graves and Alan Goodman. And I'm going to introduce Alan and Joe, and then they're going to do a presentation. And after that, I'm going to field questions to both of them. And after, if you would mind holding your questions till after the presentations, you can put questions you have in the chat, and I will look at them and put questions to the authors. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the authors and let them talk about the book rather than me introducing the book for them. Joseph Graves Jr. received his PhD in environmental, evolutionary, and systemic biology from Wayne State University in 1988. In 1994, he was elected as a fellow of the Council of American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2012, he was chosen as one of the sensational 60, commemorating 60 years of the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Award. In 2017, he was listed as an outstanding graduate in biology at Oberlin College and was an Innovator of the Year in US Black Engineer magazine. His research in evolutionary genomics and adaptation shapes our understanding of biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials. His books, he has many. They include Principles and Applications of Antimicrobial Nanomaterials, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, and Racism, Not Race, as we're going to be discussing tonight. Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. Finally, his biopic work entitled A Voice in the Wilderness, A Pioneering Biologist, explains how evolution could help us solve our biggest problems, is scheduled for publication this coming fall. And that will be one of my questions that I'll be putting to Joe. Joseph leads programs addressing underrepresentation of minorities in science. He aids underserved youth in Greensboro via the YMCA chess program. He's also served on the Racial Reconciliation and Justice Commission and the COVID Vaccination Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina. He also serves as a science advisor to the Chicago, New Brunswick, and Methodist of Ohio Theological Seminaries through the AAAS Dialogues of Science, Ethics, and Religion program. Politically, Joseph identifies as a Marxist, although currently is not affiliated with any particular party or organization. He's been active in Science for the People since 1979. His most recent publication in Science for the People are Graves Jr. and Richard Lewontin, Race, Science for the People online magazine. Their Money, Our Lives, Science for the People online magazine. Now I'm going to introduce Alan Goodman. Alan Goodman has been a professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College in Amherst, Mass. Since 1985. Previously, he served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty and Dean of Natural Sciences at Hampshire, and is a past president of the American Anthropological Association. He teaches and writes on health and nutrition, consequences of political economic processes, including poverty, inequality, and racism. Goodman has written over 100 articles and is the editor or author of 8 books, including Building a New Biocultural Synthesis, Political, Economic Perspectives on Human Biology, Nutritional Anthropology, and Race, Are We So Different? The second edition was published this year. He received his BS and PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and was a postdoctoral fellow in international nutrition at the Institute of Nutrition in Mexico and a research fellow in stress physiology at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He co-directs the AAA's, the American Anthropological Association's public education project on race that includes an award-winning museum exhibit and website. Goodman continues to be involved in public education on race and the intersections of political change and human well-being. It is my honor to welcome the two of you to the Institute of Social Ecology's discussion tonight, and off you go. I think Joseph is going to go first.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So Alan, are you running the slides?
Yes, I am, sir. Do you see my screen yet?
I don't see your screen. I see you, but not your screen.
That's so Mason, I'm getting advanced sharing options. One participant can share at a time. How's that?
There you go.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and it will
Okay,
help.
so for everybody, Joe is going to start. I'm going to take up the middle, and then Joe is going to bring us home.
Okay, and it would help if you go into presentation mode because all I see is a very small. Okay, so you guys have all seen the cover of the book. So if you could go to the next slide, Alan.
Wait 1 second, Joe.
Okay, so I mean, Alan, I don't know if people are seeing what I'm seeing because right now, your window showing you is much, much bigger than the window showing the slides. So if you can change the size relative to each other, that would help a great deal.
It looks like full screened on.
Say that again, Mason.
It's full screened on the presentation for me.
Okay, well then maybe I'm
But it's
just
definitely blocking the right part of the text and the images.
So you can.
It's full screen.
okay, there we go. I've got it. I've shifted it. So hopefully that's better for everyone. Okay. So our purpose in writing this book was to provide non-scientists concise and accessible answers to questions about race and racism. These were gleaned from questions that Alan and I had fielded over more than 30 years from students, educators, policymakers, friends, family. And this book is really written for readers who want to work towards human equity and who may be nervous about saying the wrong thing. And we found that in many cases, these two groups overlap. Next slide, please. So table of contents, chapter 1, setting the table, where we give definitions of race, racism, and human biological variation. Chapter 2 is a brief historical treatment. How did race come to be and why is it still so important? Chapter 3, everything you want to know about genetics and race. And this is where we do a deep dive on the meaning of human biological variation and how we understand it. Chapter 4, everything you wanted to know about racism, which is more about the cultural and social political aspects of racism. Chapter 5, why do races differ in disease incidence? So here we're talking about the interaction between genetics and environmental influences. Chapter 6 is on life history, aging, and mortality, which explodes numerous myths about, how people, how long they live and why. Chapter 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities. Chapter 8, races, brains, and behaviors. Chapter 9, driving while Black and other everyday struggles with institutional racism. Chapter 10, we deal with how DNA ancestry testing works and how it doesn't work. Chapter 11, race names and race mixing. Chapter 12, where we discuss what would it really take to arrive at a world without racism. And in the conclusion, reiterates what you should have learned from reading the book. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some of the questions. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm sure we'll hear some of these questions in the question and answer. For example, did the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans have a concept of race? How could European colonists justify enslavement and the decimation of native peoples? Did the end of slavery change ideas about race? Next slide, please. Chapter 7, which, resurfaces every now and then when people attempt to link genetics, race, and intelligence. So here we do, again, a deep dive demonstrating the logical fallacies engaged in this program. What is intelligence? Do genes associated with intelligence differ among races? Do races differ in personality? Do races differ in criminal behavior and violence? Next slide, please. And we conclude the final chapter, A World Without Racism, by posing questions like, how does one become anti-racist? Isn't focusing on race making it even more real, as if we could make race more real? When we really know we've reached racial equity or equality, and how do we get to racial equality? What is post-racial? And finally, intersectionality. How does anti-racism fit with the fight against other forms of oppression and social justice? Next slide. So I'm going to quickly make a point that's a crucial one that we make in this book. And quite frankly, even very learned scholars who spend a great deal of time on race and racism often get this wrong. And so, it's become a sort of platitude amongst scholars in the humanities and social sciences to say race is not a scientific concept. And in fact, that view is entirely incorrect. And it's incorrect because it fails, because it conflates two very different concepts. The first is the biological race concept, which is a real concept. It is scientific, although it has changed in the criteria used to define it, beginning with the earliest concepts having to do with what organisms look like, their morphology. And then later on in the 19th century, it shifted to being one based upon the geographical location of those organisms. In the 20th century, it was focused on the results of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was the unification of natural selection with Mendelian genetics, in which races were defined by the frequency of genes within said groups. And finally, in the 20th century, latter portion of the 20th century, based upon phylogenetic techniques, whether any group within a species could be defined as a unique evolutionary lineage. Now, the point I want to make about the biological race concept is that it was never solely about human beings. And that's the confusion that people often make, is thinking that the study of biological variation within species was always focused primarily on humans. That's in fact entirely wrong. Now, the study of variation in humans did influence the way people thought about variation within other species, but that wasn't the whole story. And in fact, what we learned about variation within other species was key with regard to overthrowing the biological race concept within humans. Now, this differs from the socially constructed or socially defined race concept, which was directly related to the history of colonialism and slavery, and that arbitrarily utilized aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only did so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. So when we named the book Racism, Not Race, we wanted to make the point that with regard to the definition of human socially defined groups, that indeed it was racism that determined what these groups were going to be. So I'm going to let Alan continue from here.
Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to try to focus on two key aspects that Joe just pointed to of the book, two key lessons. One is that humans do not have races, that human variation is way more complex. And I'm going to try to focus in a little bit on one aspect of why that's true and then give you all of them. And then secondly, as Joe said, what we often attribute to race is really due to the lived experience of racism. So I want to start by saying differences between Willie Schumacher and Wilt Chamberlain, two athletes. They're very different morphologically, but that's not race. Human variation is real. You know, we can see it, we can touch it, we can admire it. It's obvious it's patterned, but that's not race. Secondly, race as biology is a myth. It does not explain variation, as I said. And then finally, educating. And that's, I think, where we really need to kind of come together, because this is not just for scientists, this is for everybody. Educating about the myth of race as biology is necessary to eliminating racism. So I'm going to put you through a little kind of example of this. And so play along with me and imagine for a moment, as we have through history, for that there's 3, 4, or 5 different races. Imagine for a second that there are 3 races. Question is, how much would they genetically overlap? And so I'm going to show you 3 models. One is a model of no genetic overlap. And so imagine green, red, blue as 3 race groups or continental groups and individuals in the groups, and the distances are really the genetic distances between individuals. So that's no overlap. This is some overlap where there's some maybe ambiguity, and you know that an individual, say here, could be considered genetically either in the green race or blue race, and etc. And then a model of a lot of overlap where race seems to be less meaningful. So here's the 3 models, and asked audiences through the years which one they think is correct. And I'm not going to ask you to give answers, but to think for a second of which one seems to you to be most correctly describe human genetic variation from what you know about it. If you chose the first model, you would fit in really well in the 19th century, because pretty much everybody believed this sort of view in the 19th century that either God created separate races or they separately evolved, hierarchically arranged, and essentially no overlap. And I think this is still seen by some white extremists today as a view that has gone into the 21st century. This is a model that many people would say that that makes sense to them because it's what they see with their eyes. They see phenotypically, their cultural eyes, their brain teaches their eyes to see skin color differences. And so they may say, yeah, for the most part, I can separate individuals into races. So that must also be true on a genetic level. Unfortunately, it isn't. And unfortunately as well, it's our eyes picking up on certain traits that we've elevated to be seen as races that describe, traits that describe races. This is then the third model, and you say, well, this must be correct if the first 2 are incorrect. And it is correct in some degree that this is actually based on data, very famous data by the population geneticist Richard Lewontin, who very famous, maybe the most famous study in human population genetics on the apportionment of human variation, in which he found that only about 6% of variation was found among the 3 continental groups. And interestingly, almost all of that variation is found locally within any one group. So I say this is right, but actually it's not actually totally right. And so there's one more, I think, important correction to that model, which is that Lewontin could not separate out the sizes of the amount of genetic variation in different groups. Now we know by a study by you et al. In 2004 and a host of other studies that have replicated Lewontin and replicated you, that in fact, the European and Asian variation is actually a subset of the African variation. And so the European and Asian fit into the African genetic variation. And this makes great sense because we know that humans evolved in Africa. They built up the greatest amount of genetic variation in Africa. In fact, today, that's where we see the greatest amount of genetic variation. So in fact, as I said, Europeans and Asians are really a subset of African genetic variation. One interesting aspect of this is that from the study by you et al. Is if you look at the average genetic difference between two Africans, it's greater than the average genetic difference between an African and a European and African and Asian. I'll repeat that. The amount of genetic difference on average between two Africans is greater than the amount of genetic variation between an African and a European or Asian. So a new model is sort of nested Russian dolls with, if you think about genetic variation, the African is the biggest doll and everybody else fits inside. We all evolved. So just to summarize a little bit, the left is sort of the old view of race as sort of separate types. This is the new view of human variation. And what, I've just given you a taste of why race is not human variation. There's really a number of reasons why, any one of which is extremely important. Theoretically, race is typological, it's static, it can't explain itself. Evolutionary theory, not race, explains variation. The data variation is trivial among races, and that variation is explained by geography, not race. And then use. There's no way to reliably divide us into races, though scientists have tried for decades and centuries. Human variation is real. Denying race is not denying human variation. Why is this then important? Biological race gives cover to racism. It's been the justification for racism. It comes out of racism. And taking away biological race is, to use a metaphor, is like taking a gun away from those who wish to do harm. So a little bit about race versus lived experience and racism, a biological race. Racial inequalities are due to genetics. No, they're invariably not. They're too trivial. There is no such thing as racial genetics. But I just want to point out a couple different examples here. And this is from the chapter on health differentials. First off, I want to say the United States, if you don't know it, when you look at national health statistics, is really not doing well at all. And I think part of that is due to the divisions we have in society, not just healthcare, but other things. And we ranked 29th last time I looked in infant mortality. We're in the 30th or so in terms of life expectancy, and overall life expectancy is going down. And on top of that, there's a huge racial component as well. But even whites aren't doing well on an international comparison. But there's a 2.2-fold difference in infant mortality between African Americans and whites. And study after study is beginning to show how that's about the cumulative effects of growing up in a racist society, the weathering hypothesis of growing up under conditions of racism. We know something, I think, about criminality and incarceration, and that there's long been myths about criminality and tendencies towards criminality. But clearly, the imprisoned population, African Americans, are sixfold more likely to be imprisoned in 2010, and it's still about the same now, Latinx at threefold greater. This is not having anything to do with genetics or culture, but with racism. Wealth relates to everything. Average wealth differentials between white, Black, and Latinx is insanely different. But one of the things I want to say is that it's not just wealth that causes the differences in life expectancy, health, et cetera, between African American, Latinx, et cetera, other racial groups and whites. Education is important, but even at the same levels of education, there's a difference in life expectancy of whites versus Blacks. And so thinking of race as biologically real today is, one of the big questions is why after so much data, why after Lewant in 1972, do so many people think, of course, race is biological or has some biological component? Something like 2/3 of Americans do think so, but doing so inhibits both science and social justice. And Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Alan. So in the final question, we challenge our readers to imagine a world without racism. And we gave some, recent history as fodder for stimulating that thought. And here's a quote. In much of the Democratic Party, it's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist country. Now that was Nikki Haley, then former ambassador to the United Nations at the Republican National Convention in August of 2020. Now she was born Nimrata Nikki Randhawa, the daughter of Sikh parents who immigrated to the United States from Punjabi, India. Now on the other hand, Alan, next slide, please. Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris's mother was also an Indian American. Now, aside from their mothers that they both went into politics, the similarities seem to end there. Harris's mother married a man of African descent from Jamaica. She strongly identifies with her African heritage and attended Howard University. Next slide. So before George Floyd was murdered, Alan and I were making predictions about what we saw coming in 2020. We wrote the conclusion of the book, which again, we haven't corrected the slide, Racism, Not Race, in August 2020 after George Floyd murder. And both Alan and I are students of the history of white supremacy and fascism. And we predicted that if Trump lost the 2020 election, that he might attempt to call on his white supremacist base to keep him in power. And that's exactly what we saw on January 6th when he mobilized far right-wing racist organizations to march on the Capitol. And as you all have been following the news, with the January 6th hearings going on, more and more evidence is coming to light how he actively played a role to ensure that there would be violence in an attempt to keep him in the White House. Next slide, please. Or are we done with this?
We're done.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, we've seen now with the Supreme Court that he packed, that more and more assaults have been coming on what I would call basic fundamental human rights in the United States, including, overturning Roe v. Wade, but also an attempt is being made to reify white control over voting districts throughout the United States. which again will lead to the greater disenfranchisement of Black and brown voters and other things. So at this point, we're going to stop talking and we'll take your questions and see what you think about all this.
Okay, so I'm going to pose you guys some questions, and while you're answering, I'm going to peek into the chat. So folks who want to pose questions, please post them in the chat and I'll try to go through and pull them out. I want to ask each of you to reflect on how your own lived experience and also your political orientation kind of led you to the research and the writing that you're doing now. How about Joe Sabani, go first?
Well, again, that's the subject of the book that comes out on September 13th. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but you know, I was born in Jim Crow. So, you know, it wasn't hard for me to figure out that something wasn't right. But, you know, as a child coming up through a you know, racist educational system, you know, I was unprepared to deal with the impacts it was having on me. And, you know, of course, I thought, you know, everything that was happening to me was my fault. So everything around me reinforced the idea that I was inferior. And being, you know, the first African-American to ever earn a PhD in my field, I mean, I had face-to-face confrontations with people who were creating the ideology to justify my oppression. And so I talk about it in Voice, you know, about at the point at which I finally began to understand that it was the system that was at fault, not something inherently wrong with me.
And Joe, it might be great if you could put the book in the chat.
Yeah, I already did that.
Okay, great. And you know, for me, I think background-wise, I think it's a combination of growing up Jewish in a beautiful working-class Irish and Italian neighborhood, but also, you know, in being kind of on the margins, I think, of, you know, how am I different from my friends? How am I the same? And I don't know how much of that was racialized, but there were definitely worlds of difference. And in fact, and also I'd say there are class issues that went on for me that I think probably have shaped what I'm interested in, and not that my dad was a refrigeration mechanic. I talk a little bit about in the book, you know, that dropped out in middle school. And, you know, so we were working class family. And, you know, anybody that I knew that was Jewish tended to be, well, most people were more professional class. So there were differences there. So I think that sort of sensitized me to thinking about kind of myths of biology. And you know, I'm very oriented towards understanding the science and data. And, you know, so, you know, lots and lots of influences along the way.
You're muted.
Turn on your mic.
It was on and it went off somehow.
Yeah.
I'm going to pose this to either panelist can answer this question. How do you integrate language into your research conclusions? For instance, you adopted the language of African and Asian when discussing genetic diversity. Is that the language you consistently adopt and support to discuss identity and genetic difference, even within the context of racism, not race?
Good. Joe, why don't you take this? I know you.
Yeah, we have a whole chapter on that called Race Names and Race Mixing. So we refer you to actually read that. But, you know, with regard to, you know, the continents, I mean, you know, all knowledge is a result of social activity. And so to be able to get across ideas, you have to be able to use concepts that people understand. And so when I talk about the African continent, I'm talking about a body of land that most people recognize as being the African continent. Now, I go further than, the classical, colonialists who tend to try to racialize Africa, meaning that North Africa isn't part of Africa. And only people with dark complexions are Africans. I reject that. Africa, to me, is that body of land that connects to the Middle East, at the Sinai Peninsula. So, yeah, you have to use these ideas. And of course, when you talk about Asia, we're talking about a huge expanse. Where does Asia begin? Where does it end? Right. So, but within, the reference to the existing scholarly literature, particularly in genetics, you have to be able to use the terms that exist within that discipline to be able to get across your ideas, and also to debunk the racist and racialist ideas that have held sway for several centuries. So I don't know if that answers it for you or not.
Yeah, I'll add, if I can, a little bit about, it's an interesting question and a complex one. There's scientific terminology for groups, and that has shifted through time by social influence. I think scientists, for the most part, have been sensitive to how groups want to self-identify and self-explain, but that often doesn't map onto genetic variation, kind of looking at things like, what gene might be important for disease resistance, et cetera. So that's an additional problem. And, we may come to talk a little bit about the census, but this is seen in, the census, where there's another effort to begin to update the census. And just to quickly say, and we talk about this in the book, that the categories in the census have shifted every 10 years, and sometimes rather radically. But it's important to have some stability, because part of collecting census data, the US data, not just for the census, but for health and housing, employment, et cetera, is to begin to track changes through time and levels of equality and inequality. And if the names of the groups keep shifting, and why not? Because they're cultural categories, then it's hard to really be sure that we're really tracking inequalities well, et cetera. I can say more, but I'm going to stop.
I knew that there'd be a CRT question. It's unbelievable to me that talking about slavery or Black history has become a controversy. So this question is from Larissa Honey, or Honey. With the rapid passage of anti-critical race theory legislation across the country, what can academics do to ensure that we are able to teach about the realities of race and racism in the classroom?
Well, this course doesn't surprise me. Again, it's something that I predicted was going to happen. The most powerful weapon that capitalism has in its arsenal is racism. And it wants to preserve the efficacy of that weapon. And so therefore trying to keep people ignorant and trying to make sure that people can't present how racism works to oppress people is something that they're going to do. So, the question of what should scholars do about that, it comes down to resistance. Because, we are at a very dangerous time in not just the United States, but I would say most of the world with regard to the capacity of fascist type and racial supremacist type political organizations who want to seize power and do away with even, the thin veneer of democracy that exists in this country. And so now the question is whether we're going to allow them to do it or not. So it comes down to resistance, explaining why these ideas are wrong and standing up to them.
Yeah, I just want to add, thank you, Joe. It pisses me off to no end that there is such a extreme reaction to critical race theory, and as Joe said, it's unfortunately predictable. That folks are so friggin' thin-skinned that they can't learn about slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, etc. That's not something that their ears are too sensitive to hear that stuff. And, so grow up. It's time that this country kind of grows up and realizes it, and, and gets over it. Because if we're not going to have truth, we're not going to get very far.
If it's okay as moderator, I'm gonna insert myself, and Alan's speaking to what's called white fragility. I don't think it's about growing up or being sensitive. I think it's about straight up racism and reaction. And when any, it's a historical process that when any, oppressed group gains any kind of visibility or traction or visible traction, there's a reaction, and it's called backlash. And so the anti-CRT, or just the misization of teaching Black history, is now a theory, a critical race theory. That's a straight up racist, fascist, authoritarian dogma. And it really has to be seen as such. I don't believe it's just white fragility. It's not a psychological problem. It's a political problem.
Let me explain. I would not say white fragility, but but there's hiding behind facts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have a social ecology question for the social ecologists here. So social ecology entails a rereading of the deterministic reading of natural evolution. How does your work show, as an evolutionary biologist, how do you address these problematic conceptions of evolution in your own work? And like, how did you as an evolutionary biologist in your own education and your own life as a researcher, how did you come to take the position that you take?
Again, not wanting to, give you a preview of the book that comes out on September 13th, where I explain how I think about evolution, how I came to think about evolution. You need to understand which aspects of evolution are determinist and which aspects of evolution are stochastic. Okay, so natural selection is deterministic. I mean, they're well worked out in mathematics of how natural selection works. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is not. It's stochastic. And genetic drift and natural selection operate together to chart the course of evolution for all the species on this planet. So, that's how I learned it. And I learned from some of the greatest minds in the history of evolution. So if you see my evolutionary tree, I mean, I go back to Debunking, back to Lewontin, so I understand this stuff probably as well as anybody in the world.
That's why we're so lucky to have you here. Thank you. A few people have put in the chat, this question that a lot of people on the left suffer from, which is that a lot of people feel like they just can say, well, race is a social construct, and just sort of leave it there. And they can't really explain what that means, or after you've established race as a social construct, meaning it's not real, that sort of gives you sort of permission to kind of, again, leave it there and not really go further. And as two scientists, how can you help push people beyond simply just saying it's a social construct, it's socially constructed? And how do you develop kind of like a scientific literacy so that people have more tools to talk about race and racism than simply just saying it's a social construct?
I'll go first. I'm sure Joe will want to add to this. You do have to engage with the science to say that it's a social construct and not know why it isn't biological. I think hasn't worked. Explain sickle cell to me. Everybody should be able to explain why, for example, sickle cell is due to evolution and not have anything to do with race. But I think most people, can't do that. But we could go through why sickle cell is not a racial trait, as it's been thought to very, very quickly. I don't think it's a super heavy lift, and that's one of the things we try to do in the book, is to sort of lay out quite simply why race is not what you think it is. Race is not biological, but it is a social political construct. And you have to understand both. You can't just understand that it's a social political construct, but also why it's not biological. To not do that, as I said, kind of weaponizes those who want to do harm. And it continues the institutional discrimination, et cetera.
And as we point out, I mean, all knowledge is socially constructed. So to say that race is socially constructed, you don't get anywhere with that. So what one has to understand is mechanistically, what are we actually talking about when we talk about biological race, and why there are no biological races within the human species? Because there are plenty of species that do have biological races. We just don't happen to be one of them. So now, this is not something that started with Alan Goodman and Joe Graves, by the way. There is a long scholarship about biological variation in nature that goes back to people before Linnaeus. And so, since people in the humanities and social sciences aren't trained in that scholarship, just like people in biology and genetics aren't trained in history and social sciences, there's a need for more truly transdisciplinary training. And that's one of the things that I spent my entire career doing. So I've been teaching these ideas to people in the humanities, the social sciences, African-American studies for over 30 years. But there's not enough me's out there. There's not enough Allens out there. This is, a course that I've argued should be taught at every university in America. And certainly people in social sciences need to have a course like this. Sometimes they're taught out of anthropology departments, sometimes they're taught out of ethnic studies, but this needs to be incorporated in the training certainly of every PhD student in the social sciences, and I would also argue humanities as well.
Yeah, I just want to add, just thinking of that, what could be more important than to understand finally, what race is and what race isn't? And Obama tried to have a national conversation about race. Like many, it just hit the surface, and it avoided going into biology and genetics. Oh, that's too complicated. We don't want to go there. UNESCO in 1950s, kind of waded in, but even UNESCO sort of pulled back and saying, oh, we can't, the science is getting too complicated for us or something like that. It's time for some national education about what race is and isn't.
Yeah, I do notice that Obama didn't invite us to that conversation. And I don't think that was accidental.
So I have another question for you guys. And it's, if you could kind of go back to, Alan has the 3 circles, and the idea that Asians and Europeans would be a subset of the genetic diversity in on the African continent. Can you talk more and give it more of a timeline? Because Joe, you just said that there are animal species that do have subspecies that could be race-like, but that human beings, as Alan has taught me, haven't been around long enough to generate that kind of diversity. Can you speak to that?
Okay, so it's not just time. It's also selection and genetic gene flow. So in the case of our species, anatomically modern humans, we're about now 350,000 years old. And certainly if selection had acted on different human groups in different localities strong enough, we could have formed subspecies, but it never did.
Right.
And that's what people don't get, that when we look at, the nature of adaptation that humans display across the globe, it's really not a hell of a whole lot. And part of that is because of our advanced intelligence compared to other species. So we were able to deal with environmental challenges in ways that weren't capable, other organisms weren't capable to deal with. So part of the reason is selection wasn't strong enough between, local groups of humans. And humans have always had massive amounts of gene flow between our population centers. And so if you look at the mathematical models, of genetic drift, it only took like one person per 1,500 years, between the major population centers on our planet to maintain genetic continuity. So bottom line is what people see in terms of our physical attributes, in terms of actual genomic differences, is minuscule. So, example, take skin color. Skin color is determined by maybe 6 major genes out of 19,000, another 14 genes contributing to skin color. I mean, that's less than 1/1,000th of a percent. So what people think are major things, in fact, are not.
And just to say a little bit more, I think what Joe is referring to is so culture, our technologies have provided, have allowed us to adapt. So we didn't need to have selection adapting. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, there's a apparent contradiction that we're a worldwide species. And so you'd think, well, gee, there must be lots of geographic variation. And there is some geographic variation, but it's continuous. Location explains the differences between two groups, how different they are. And as Joe said, just a little bit of genetic flow between groups can equalize. So two, I'm going to make this up, but, two populations of snakes on opposite sides of a pond will genetically differentiate because they have no way to cross back over the pond. But humans have always been intermingling, Cole Porter, the urge to merge.
Here's a kind of related question. Would other human subspecies that have since gone extinct, but which anatomically modern humans have repeatedly interbred with, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, be considered biological races?
I would argue no. I know other people have argued yes. But the simple fact of the matter is, one, we don't have enough numbers to accurately make that assessment. So, the number of, of DNA sequences from Neanderthals across the globe is only in the hundreds. The number of archaic humans skeletons found from the continent of Africa, again, are in the, I think it's dozens. So we don't have a means to be able to determine whether that's true or not. And, the amount of time between when the ancestors of these species, when the common ancestor of all these species existed, is actually less than the amount of time that anatomically modern humans have existed. So the answer is we don't really know. And I would argue probably not.
But there's a probably not, but we could potentially test that out. Joe, get back in here in a second. By looking at, say, Wright's FST, if you want to get into the weeds there a little bit. But I don't know that that's, I'm also thinking about why is this an important question. Clearly there was interbreeding between Denisovans, Neanderthals, modern humans, and I think clearly there was no concept of race, at that point in time. There may have been ideas about difference, etc. But there was but whether or not they would fit into the zoological or Sewell-Wrightian notions of subspecies or races, maybe, but why is that important?
And some people argue that the Neanderthals were in fact a separate species, not
initially
a subspecies, but actually a separate species. But the bottom line is we really don't have the samples to be able to make that judgment accurately. And again, I don't think it's really that important of a question, especially with regard to understanding modern human biological variation. We know that, for example, introgression from Neanderthals accounts for some unique alleles with regard to altitude adaptation in the Himalayas, but not in East Africa and not in South America. So, no big deal. Introgression happens all the time in nature. So people like Swante Pabo and others who are trying to make all this big deal out of, Neanderthal introgression in humans, I question what's the rationale for doing that, other than trying to make Europeans more special than they are.
Thank you. So I have a question for both of you. Social ecology kind of celebrates the concept of having kind of a cultural unity in cultural diversity. And there's clearly a legacy since the 60s, and some might say even before, of identity politics, where groups of people who've been racialized as Black or Brown have a very warm and important connection to notions of Blackness that are racialized. So how do you as scientists relate to or make sense of people's cultural identities as being Black or Brown when the idea of a race that's Black or Brown is a faulty scientific idea?
Well, I'm Black. I relate to being African American. You can call me anything for late for dinner if you wish, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the genetic variation within the species. So, and cultures evolve, they change through time, but it's by a very different process than Darwinian natural selection. The two have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So I'm not, because I say that there are no biological races within the human species, doesn't mean that socially defined races can't have identities and things that they are proud of. And I'm an example of a person who's very proud of my African American heritage.
This is from Neil Markowitz. What are your aspirations, the both of you as scholars and researchers, for extending the scope of the book's arguments to other platforms beyond the book to reach additional audiences at such a critical time that we're facing right now?
Thanks, Neil. I'll go first and say that we wanted to write a book that is accessible, that breaks down a big set of issues into manageable chunks that you can dive into. I think we were successful, but that books are not the end of the story, clearly. Discussions like this, I think, are helpful, and I want to thank the ISC for allowing us to talk about the subject matter of the book. I think that it's groups, the American Anthropological Association has been trying for a good decade to website, museum exhibit with millions of visitors. That's helpful. Joe and I were both in a documentary called Race, the Power of an Illusion that's now on Canopy and is accessible, and I recommend it, though it's getting a little bit out of date, but the basic messages still stay the same. Couple of things I'm doing. I'm working with UNESCO, and I'm hopeful that UNESCO will come back in and do a new statement on race, because I think UNESCO is powerful. I think this is an international problem. So UNESCO is an appropriate organization to doing that. I'm working with a number of journalists from the Knight Foundation for Scientific Journalism that are trying to launch something like, working off of the 1619 project, a project that gets into New York Times and major news outlets, why science was so central to the story of race and racism in the country. So unfortunately, there's lots of work left to be done.
Yeah, and You know, I'm actually appalled myself at how little coverage this book has gotten. But again, I know why, because we provide answers that are very threatening to the status quo of racial injustice in this country. So it's a whole lot easier to read people's work that's easily dismissed. It's a whole lot harder to dismiss what Alan and I have written. And so that's why I think we don't get as much coverage. Now, in terms of work that I do, I've already talked about, teaching in various university courses over the course of my career. The last 2 years with my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup of the pathology department at Duke University, we've given over 40 grand round lectures at medical departments across the country, taking on racial medicine, which, by the way, is still a major problem in the practice of medicine in the United States. We've written perspective pieces that have appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, in academic medicine. Due to our paper on in academic medicine, the American College of Pediatrics came out with a statement against racial medicine 2 weeks after our paper came out, although they didn't cite us. So, we're doing the work we need to do. I work with church groups. I'm on the Racial Justice and Reconciliation Commission of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina. I have the ear of both bishops. So, I've met with various church groups, and that's the work that needs to be done. And more people need to take up this challenge because, 2 scholars is not enough.
Can I add a little bit more? Thank you, Joe. I've been thinking about where we're at in relationship to global warming and, anthropogenic global warming. And Brian Tokar, I think, was here, and thank you for some help here. I'm thinking about how there became a scientific consensus finally with global warming, and now the public is slowly getting there. And compared to race, the myth of race as biology, I think we're approaching a scientific consensus. We've been much more invested in that concept. It's a social contract. So it's been harder even than global warming. But now I think it's really time for public education. So I'm hoping we'll be there. The next thing I want to write is about the history of efforts that were against scientific racism. And these go back to, for instance, Frederick Douglass. But part of the question, these are heroes who, kind of led the way, spoke against the hegemony of the time. But one of my questions is, why weren't they listened to? And maybe the answers are all too obvious.
I have 2 questions that I'm going to kind of put out together because they're sort of similar. And one is from Jake Baltimore and one is Larissa Honey. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong. First, could the authors speak to issues related to race-based medicine, which Joe just mentioned, which seems to have grown traction in the medical context? Are social public health interventions becoming reconfused with racialized genetics? That's one. I'm going to read the second one because it's connected. I know you addressed this in the book, but what is a simple answer we can offer to people without a biology background who argue that race is real because they've taken an ancestry test that tells them they're 100% European? For example, one question I've been asked is, if Europeans are a subset of African genetic diversity, why doesn't that show up in my DNA test? So those are kind of related, racial medicine and the DNA tests that are kind of making a mess of things.
All right, if you don't mind me taking this one first. So for everybody, I'm putting into the chat a series of articles that I published in 2022 about racial medicine and how it's completely and thoroughly idiotic. With regard to ancestry, we have a chapter on ancestry, and ancestry testing is based upon genetic markers that appear mainly in the non-coding portion of the genome, which doesn't face natural selection and therefore can differ enough to give you a signal with regard to continental origin, but that's recent origin. So it's not testing monomorphic loci that are shared by all people. So that's why the DNA ancestry tests are not telling you how African you are, because what it's looking at are recent variants that arose in different geographical regions after people left Africa. So yeah.
As a non-scientist, I want to ask you about that, Joe. So you said that the modern human is about 350,000 years old. So these ancestry tests, people think they're getting results that are showing this, deep primordial human history of the modern human. But when you're saying it's a sort of small window, how far back is it going?
Well, again, we know, we have some idea when different human beings ended up in different places during the grand migration of our species. Mm-hmm. So for modern Europeans, you're talking about maybe 50,000 years ago. For, East Asians, or again, in the same area, 40,000. Australoids, maybe 70,000. Amerindians, even shorter than that, because that would be on the order of 25,000. So, the tests are essentially showing recent differentiation that are the result of that global migration. But it's not showing you the loci that everybody shares in common. So you're talking about 99.9% of the human genome. Any two people in the globe share that in common. So the markers that are being used to determine continental ancestry are the ones that result from the 0.1%. Yeah. And that's, of course, a lot of markers, because we're talking about a 3.3 billion base pair genome. So that's several hundred million markers. So that's how you can get that signal of recent migration. But so it's not testing the amount that's shared by everyone.
Yeah, can I add first, we're using continental, or the 23andMe, Ancestry.com are using continental or, racial or ethnic language. They would be better off if they did geographic coordinates, but of course that's not culturally meaningful, but that's really what they're doing. And what they're doing is, as Joe said, they're taking what's called ancestry informative markers, things that have been shown to differentiate non-coding, regions of the DNA that have been shown to differentiate. And they develop algorithms to try to apportion people to different areas or ethnic groups. And what's interesting is you can take, the same test by different groups and come up with different answers, because they're using different algorithms, and the algorithms change through time because they're based on how people self-identify. And so as the samples they're using changes through time. But the important thing is, this has nothing to do with race. This is just simply tracing ancestry. Ancestry is not the same as race. I want to say a word about medicine, and please read Joe's articles, read our chapter. But evidence of some change is that there used to be so many different kind of medical conditions, test results that had a racial component built in. So for instance, your results on bone density test, you have to check off whether or not what your race is, and your results will be different depending on what your race is. And so race is built into the medical system. However, finally, individuals are beginning to take race out of those algorithms. And part of the reason they're doing it is that they're realizing that there's so much variation in, say, European or whatever group they're using, that they can't justify using it. There's just too much variation. And in fact, the test results tend to do better without a racial component. The worst example of this probably recently has been in looking at concussions in the NFL. And if anybody wants details of that, I can, or Joe can talk more about it. But anyway, I'm going to stop there.
I'm going to hitchhike on what you're saying, just as a non-scientist plebeian, that, this idea that that this racist notion that Black people have higher pain thresholds, thus require less pain medication, that they have different thresholds for determining whether they're concussed or not. I mean, these kinds of things are very alive and well and living in contemporary medicine. It's quite horrifying. And I literally hear on on TV almost all of the time somebody talking about a certain drug being good for this race or not that race, or et cetera, et cetera. And these things are so dangerous. And I thought, Alan, if you could speak to, Alan did a public health program for years with 8th graders. I thought it was one of the coolest projects that I've heard about, to go into the community with 8th graders. And you did a whole project on TUMS and osteoporosis. If you could talk about that, I think that would be really interesting to people.
Thanks. Yeah. And so, yeah, and I'll just sort of say in terms of education, I think middle school is a great time to educate where individuals are kind of learning, about biology and things of that sort. And, there's a possibility of kind of doing, as Joe said, sort of real interdisciplinary work, and, including even, history and science being taught together with mathematics is really a wonderful way to learn both. So what I did is I went in and I gave a simple lecture to a group of 8th graders at Amherst Middle School. And I've done this for a number of years. In the second year I did it, I brought in a Tums bottle, and the back of the Tums bottle has a little line saying, this, calcium supplement is, helps prevent osteoporosis, and Caucasians, get that word, get that out of your vocabulary, Caucasian and Asians, and didn't talk about Latinx or Africans or African-derived populations. And so the students got really incensed and wanted to know what's going on. And so they ended up writing to Smith Kline Beecham, the maker of Tums. Smith Kline Beecham wrote back, said, we have nothing to do with it. The FDA is, approves the wording. So they wrote to the FDA, a couple of times, didn't get anything back, but a few years later, that label disappeared.
But can you say, what is the story of the research that where the FDA got this idea?
Yeah, I mean, the research is just so incredibly flimsy. Is basically it comes down to when you trace where they got the information, and that, well, first off, if you looked at it, circa 2000, a review of risk factors for osteoporosis, usually age, sex, something, and race shows up as a risk factor. So what is that all about? And a lot of it turns out to be related to studies done by Mildred Trotter, great biological anthropologist, in the 1960s, looking at cadavers in Cleveland that were unclaimed bodies. And she took a bunch of African Americans, European Americans, men and women, and looked at the bone densities and found out that, yes, they were different, but they all lost bone at approximately the same rate. But, African American and women and men in her sample had more bone to start. So she never said that Blacks were somehow protected from osteoporosis or don't get osteoporosis, but simply that, that they started with more and the rates of loss were the same. And so everybody sort of repeated this myth or this idea over and over again. Sample sizes were 20, 20, 20, 20 for each race sex group. And, just to give you an idea of how the rubber hits the road is that, in around 2000, in Albany Medical School was doing a pre-osteoporosis screening, and African Americans who went in for screened were turned away because they don't get osteoporosis.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, who is doing these studies? And the body of people in medicine and biomedical research are the people who are from the, socially dominant racial groups in the United States. So racial medicine doesn't really hurt them because the medicine they're doing is really all about them. and they don't really care what happens to Black and brown people. So what passes for scientific method when it comes to things associated with race in biomedical research and medicine is ridiculous. I mean, I can give you an example. I just wrote a chapter on race in the microbiome, in which, these people used a machine learning algorithm based upon a sample of, I think it was 12 African Americans compared to several hundred European Americans, and made the claim that, the microbiomes of Black people and white people are different from each other. I mean, this stuff would never fly if we're in any other type of study, but because of structural racism and racial ideology and white supremacy in this community, this BS goes across all the time. You guys have no idea how much time I've spent demonstrating the complete lunacy of this kind of thinking and being ignored. In the early 90s, when they first wanted to do the racial inclusion stuff in NIH, I was on those panels, and I explained to them how ridiculous their designs were. So their response, they stopped inviting me to the panels.
Yeah, I mean, I hear your frustration, and I call it moral outrage, which any good leftist knows is essential to make change. You have to have a good dose of moral outrage. I wanted to know, Joe, if you could speak to your experience in Science for the People, because that obviously was an attempt to confront not just racism, but racist science, and to do that in a popular, public kind of way. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, and again, the book comes out in the fall. I spend a great deal of time on that, but that's where I got the tools to learn how to see through the fallacies of class interests in scientific research as well as racial interests. Was definitely coming in contact with people like Richard Lewontin, people like John Vandermeer at Michigan, people like Richard Levins. That's where I learned how and why it wasn't me, because you got to understand that everything around me was saying there was something wrong with me, that I was supposed to go along with this white supremacist program, that, they wanted me to be them. And I said, oh, hell no, not going to be you, which is why, by the way, I didn't receive my PhD at the University of Michigan, because I walked out. I had enough. So I can't do this. That's why, years went by and I went back and I finished at Wayne State. So yeah. And that's what drove the change that became the person that you know today.
Can you define, because most people here don't know what Science for the People is. Can you just give a teeny brief history of what it is, how it started and where it is today? And if you wouldn't mind, tell more about that story of why you had to leave Michigan, why it became untenable for you.
Sure. Science for the People originally started out as a group called Scientists Against the Vietnam War. And this was in the late 1960s. But they, the individuals involved realized that there was a bigger problem, which was the way in which the scientific enterprise had always been co-opted to serve the interests of the ruling class. And so what Science for the People did is it began to ask questions about what would science look like if it really were serving everyone instead of serving the interests of profit. So that's the main idea. And it has had periods of which there were more people involved and bigger national, international profile. And that sort of, died away in the 90s and has now recently surfaced in the 2010s with a new editorial board, younger people getting involved. So for people who, have interests in thinking about how science is historically associated with the interests of the ruling class, Science for the People is a very good place to go. So I certainly recommend taking a look at the website and the online magazine, and joining, because it's doing what I consider to be really good work. Now, why did I leave the University of Michigan? Because I got involved in politics as a graduate student. And again, without telling the whole story in the book, it was that political work which got me to the point where I just simply stopped going to classes, because I felt that they were just not relevant anymore. And when you stop going to classes, you know, you fail classes. And no one in the graduate school attempted to keep me there. At one point, this is literally a statement in the student newspaper that said, you know, referring to me, this self-styled Marxist-Leninist is the most dangerous man on campus, end quote. And I was at the time. A lot of things that happened, like GEO getting the university to sign the contract, was directly due to my work.
Wow.
So, and as a result, when my grade point dropped below 3.0, they threw me out. There was no meeting, there was no temp, you know, even though I was like the only Black graduate student in ecology and evolution, there's no attempt to keep me there. They just threw me out. Said, get kicking here.
Listen, I need to read that story. It's an amazing story. Could you just, for people again who don't know, the Science for People started around the Vietnam War, and then it got really focused on the sort of nuclear issue. And where is it kind of now topically? Is it kind of more climate oriented?
No, it's the whole thing. You know, the most recent issue was about agriculture. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of people there who've always been in agroecology, which again is a really big deal because, you know, that's where our pandemics start, right? Because of the attempt to squeeze every dime out of the raising of animals in closed conditions, which are perfect for the evolution of pathogens. So, wow. You know, it's got a broad footprint now in terms of issues that they address. And again, you can see that by just going to the website.
Yeah, I'm also a member of Science for the People, and just as a general comment, you know, as Joe is, you know, kind of the ground zero for is this needing to separate your science from your politics. And, you know, that's been pressure on scientists. Yeah. Hopefully that's being lifted a little bit. You know, my talking with Richard Lewontin, who, you know, was at Harvard, you know, tenured professor, you know, and he was, you know, he and Richard Levins were, you know, part of the inspiration for Science for the People. You know, they, you know, they had built up their scientific credentials quite well. The other, you know, and so what happened, Science for the People was not able to maintain a magazine in the 70s. I remember, you know, you could go into an Amherst Hastings bookstore and get Science for the People next to Look Magazine and People and whatever other things that you could pick up, and you could learn about, you know, agroecology, about sex and gender issues and things of that sort. And but sometime, I think in the late 70s, they were just not able to maintain themselves as a nonprofit with nobody basically making a salary. And then finally, I think maybe about 8 years ago, there was actually a conference at University of Massachusetts that tried to revive Science for the People. And now it has been revived, as Joe said, as a new publication, as especially a nice online presence. I really suggest looking at it. And I think the next issue coming up is on militarism.
I also have a question for the two of you that kind of speaks to the relationship between anti-Black racism or anti-Black and brown racism and anti-Jewish racism. And just watching the hearings in the last weeks, you know, the hearing yesterday where the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys had a very major role in that series of events, and that they're white nationalists, and they do believe that Jews are part of an international cabal that is orchestrating the browning of the color line, and that they're trying to bring in immigrants and promote intermarriage between the so-called races, and that Jews are kind of like the puppet masters, and Black people are, you know, demonized.
Alan forced me to write this book. I just want you guys to know, you know, I really didn't want to be part of it, you know, and then the cabal came in and, you know, they forced me to start typing. Yeah, that's what it is.
So
everybody, that's a joke, and nobody forces Joe to do anything.
So what I want to say is, you know, that something that I've become really interested in years of late, that Eric Ward is a really important anti-racist writer and speaker who talks about how if you want to really counter white nationalism, you have to really look at anti-Black racism as well as anti-Jewish racism, because white nationalism really sits at the fulcrum of both of those. And I'm wondering if you guys could speak to how does anti-Jewish racism sort of figure in this book and in your own thinking in terms of looking at the overall question of racism?
I'll start and say, we do, a few different moments of talking about anti-Jewish racism, and, for example, talking about in 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain and whether or not that was a racially motivated. And clearly there were ideas about, that were maybe I call proto-racial, but clearly, sort of race as a science the ball had not really been moving yet. I think that when I think about the racialization of Jews, it's such a farce in a way, and it's such a proving ground for how thin veneered sort of biologization and racialization is, and that Jews as a race stand in for the worst of capitalism, the worst of communism. It's all what you want to imagine it to be. But in the history of Western thought, though, Jews have been racialized, and even though that is entirely nonsensical. We talk about in 1899, William Z. Ripley's Races of Europe, Jews are listed, and Carlton Kuhn, professor at Harvard, has Jews listed as a European race. And this goes past World War II. There's clearly on the right, an effort to try to racialize Jews, and I don't want to talk about Hitler as an extreme, but just as a kind of well-documented case. In 1918, Adolf Hitler writes what's called the Gemlish letter. Go into this in a little bit of detail. And what he says in that letter to Herr Gemlish is he says we have to kind of treat the Jews as a biological element, that just simply treating them as a religion or a folk or a culture, is just going to be seen as prejudice, but we really need to treat them. And he knew this consciously, that this was incorrect, as a racial element. And then we can base our policies on science. And, just to say, and now here we are in 2022, 104 years after the Gemlish letter. And, we still have echoes of that, and Jews will not replace us, etc.
Actually, Ellen, could you speak to that, to what the Great Replacement means? And because a lot of people are not really aware of that, and how that's part of white nationalist narratives that are really central to how people are understanding race right now. A lot of people.
The only thing I'll say is I think a little bit what you said in the introduction is, this idea of great replacement theory, and somebody else can probably knows better than I, where this really came from intellectually, use that word in quotes. But, the Jews will not replace us is not that the Jews are going to multiply and replace, but that somehow, as Joe said, Jews are puppet masters that are somehow going to go against their, the white race and replace individuals of white race with, somehow orchestrate migration. And this is, with Bowers and the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue said very, very clearly in his manifesto that he was going after Jews because they were running organizations that had that were pro-immigration.
Yeah, and this all comes from the the reality of the fact that persons of European descent will no longer be the numerical majority in the United States by 2045. And so what these white supremacists are doing, and many of them are now mainstream within the Republican Party, as well as many Democrats, they want to create an apartheid state where a minority population can hold on to its political power. That's why there's been so much effort to eliminate the teaching of critical race theory, to maintain gerrymandering throughout the former Confederate states and in many of the northern states, and also to disenfranchise as many African Americans as possible and other groups that are non-white. So this is, again, not accidental. There are people who think about this stuff, and they're actively trying to implement this and to convince, whites who don't think about these things that they should be getting on board.
So it's around 7:35. I was wondering if I could ask you guys both to kind of maybe end with a statement about kind of what next, and what do you guys plan to do, but also what do you ask of people who are reading the book to do in terms of how do we make the world less racist, and how do we promote a better understanding of human variation that counters racist notions of race?
Well, if you don't mind me starting, Alan.
No.
In my church, they've already done a study of racism, not race. And I made sure that I wasn't there, because I actually go to a church that's historically white. And it was led by people who understand racism and who are allies in trying to, expand anti-racist work. And this work really needs to be done amongst white folk, because quite frankly, Black and brown people, we understand how racism works.
Right.
Okay? And sure, there are misconceptions amongst Black and brown folks, which is why we wrote the book for everybody. But the real work needs to be done in the white community with regard to understanding how racism actually isn't to their benefit. Because the reason it currently stands is because most people of European descent in this country think that racism benefits them. And until that's overturned, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, two things. One is, and I think this discussion has really amplified it, and for me, is how important getting the science back into kind of social justice work, into the left is, and kind of having a strong scientific voice, I think, is super important. The other thing I want to say, is I think racism is part of every existential crisis we're facing. It's not a side part of it, it's right at the core, because racism is about kind of splitting us apart. And so, as Joe said, who's going to benefit from anti-racism? Who's going to benefit from taking that gun away from, that ideological gun of biological race away? Yes, Black and brown people are going to benefit because they've been the targets, but everybody is going to benefit. It's dividing everybody. And, I think racism hurts white folks, and, that white folks are dying of whiteness, and they're dying by holding on to their whiteness, and white life expectancies are decreasing, and that's tied to the belief in whiteness. And so, it's a book for everybody. I think it's a lesson for everybody, and it's time we face up to race and racism.
Thank you. I want to say Alan is pointing to a book that's called Dying of Whiteness, and it basically looks at how poor whites are voting against their class interests to their own physical detriment. They're dying earlier, younger, increased morbidity, mortality, while just because they're clinging to this idea of being white, at least better than people who are not white. I want to just again say that there's a link in the chat. The book is phenomenal, and I encourage people to buy one and give it to somebody that you know, because this is not right now I'm not promoting it as a commodity at all, but really this is a political tool to put in all of our toolkits to bring to the movements that we're part of, and to bring to our faith communities, and bring to our political collectives. I think it's really, really important to increase science literacy, increase that and put that into our anti-racist kind of strategy. I want to finish by thanking both of you. Joseph Graves, thank you so much for your time and your incredible knowledge and history. And Alan Goodman, thank you so much for being with the Institute for Social Ecology tonight. And thanks to everybody who took one of your precious summer nights to sit with us and make a little bit of anti-racist history here. So I think that's about it. If you want to get in touch with either Alan Goodman or Joseph Graves, you can contact the Institute for Social Ecology, and they will put you in touch with them if you have future questions or more questions that you didn't get to pose tonight. Okay, thanks folks so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention.